Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this month's segment of the Caveon webinar series. I'm very pleased to introduce our guests today. We put together an amazing session. It's called Lessons Learned from Using Statistics to Invalidate Scores. An all-star panel has been assembled. And first, I want to introduce Liz Burns. Liz is the Director of Education Services for the Certification and Marketing Programs at Juniper Networks. And as long as I have known Liz, she has been relentless in her efforts to do everything she can to protect her IT certifications, items, and tests. Next, we have Rachel Schenig. Rachel is the Assistant Vice President and Head of Test Security at ACT, one of the largest test programs in all the world. And Rachel, in addition to her test security responsibilities, has a background as an attorney. I've presented with her many times. She is a weapon when it comes to protecting ACT. Next, we have another JD. Jennifer Semko is a partner focusing on dispute resolution at Baker & McKenzie. A big part of Jennifer's practice focuses on certification and licensure assessment programs. Again, I've had the opportunity to present with Jennifer many times. And when it comes to understanding both the power and the nuance of test use agreements, candidate agreements, there may not be a more knowledgeable person in the entire world than Jennifer. So it's great to have her with us. Next, we've got Jack Terry. Jack Terry is the Executive Director of the National Board of Examiners in Optometry. I haven't known Jack as long as some of the other panelists, but I do know that he has an extensive academic and professional background, not only in optometry, but also in assessment. Lastly, we're joined by my good friend and colleague, Dennis Maines. Dennis is Caveon Test Security mad scientist, well, chief scientist and the architect of our data forensic service. So that's the all-star panel we have gathered together, and without further ado, let's get started. A bit of housekeeping. You have a dashboard. Everyone is muted, but you do have a dashboard, and please feel free to weigh in with questions that are spawned by the conversation. So we'll do our best to address all of those. We do have some questions prepared that the panel will respond to, and then at the end we'll share some conclusions. Next slide, please. So I thought in order to frame this discussion, it would be important, we thought it would be important to talk a little bit about why an organization would use statistics to invalidate scores. And I know a couple of our panelists have some ideas here. Dennis, do you mind starting us off?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So when you think about it, it's really all about validity and what we're trying to do. We use statistics and models to make sure that our tests measure what we intended to measure. Now today we're talking about using statistics and models to make sure that our tests actually measured what we wanted them to measure. That's what this is about. It's not about putting a label on a person or it's not talking about the person's behavior. It's talking about test scores and if they're trustworthy. And we do this by looking at the data and finding statistical anomalies, things that are so unusual as to call into question the test score. Now, some of these things are like having too many answers that are the same as the person who is in the next seat, or answering the test questions at superhuman speeds. So quickly you can't even read the question that fast. Or maybe having too many wrong to right answer changes. You know, there are a lot of others. You know, we're not going to talk about those specifically today. We're talking about the process, but we're really talking about making a judgment about test scores and not test takers.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Now, Rachel, why do you think it's important to use statistics in dealing with high-stakes tests?
Thanks, Steve. I just wanted to share from a practitioner's perspective and from someone whose team does this daily, that I think that having statistics are really one of the most important tools my investigators have in their toolkits. First, when we use statistics, it really helps us to focus our resources on the most concerning or aberrant results, and that way we know we're focusing our efforts in areas where we can have the biggest impact for our company and for our examinees and score users. And second, I feel like if explained well, statistics can be one of the strongest and most persuasive pieces of evidence that we have when invalidating scores or defending that decision or taking other actions in our program or network. So statistics are just very, very powerful. And while they're not a cure-all, I think they should really be one of the building blocks of a comprehensive test security framework. So I would just encourage organizations that if they don't use statistics to explore ways that they can do so. So I just wanted to share that experience as we launch into these questions, Steve.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Rachel. So just kind of to gauge where people are in this area, I wanted to launch a poll. And so the question is, have you ever invalidated a score due to a statistical analysis flag? And the responses are yes, solely because of the flag, yes, partly because of the flag, and also due to other evidence. No, we've never invalidated it due to a statistical flag, or I'm not sure. So if you don't mind, please take just a moment and let us know if you've done this. And I can see we've got a majority that have already responded. I'll leave it open for about 10 more seconds. All right, we've got about 80% of people have responded. I'm going to close this, and then I'm going to share the results. Looks like 11% of the attendees have, based just on a statistic. Half the group using statistics and other evidence. 28% have not, and 8% aren't sure. So interesting. Dennis, any reactions to that?
Well, I'm actually encouraged because I see a lot of people who resist using invalidating based just on a flag alone. And I think the message about validity is really getting there. And we'll talk about that later on in the presentation, but I think this is great.
Excellent. So let's kind of launch in. Time for the first question. I'm going to pose this to the resident attorney, Jennifer Semko. Jennifer, if a candidate hires legal counsel and contests a score invalidation, what are the 3 most important things you should do? Next slide, please.
Well, first and foremost, don't second-guess your decision. For those of you out there who are fortunate enough not to have to deal with attorneys very much, it can be a little bit nerve-shaking, a little rattling when you make a tough decision about a score invalidation and then you get an angry letter from an attorney. But don't lose sight of your mission. Don't lose sight of the reason that you invalidated the score in the first place. And remember that nothing has changed simply because someone has protested the change. Have confidence in your decision and don't lose sight of why you made that decision in the first place. Second, be prepared to provide to that test taker's attorney a high-level summary of both the contractual and the factual basis for your decision. Now, the amount of detail you give that attorney is going to vary depending on the circumstances. But at the end of the day, in your response to that attorney should walk away with an understanding of what entitled you to do this, most likely a provision in your candidate agreement, and what the reason, what the factual basis for the decision was at some level of detail. And again, that level of detail will vary depending on the circumstances. And then third, and I promise this is not a self-serving statement, bring your own attorney on board as soon as you get contacted by a test taker's counsel. Make it a fair fight. Have legal representation when the candidate brings in legal representation. Among other things, that attorney can give you advice on my second tip, how much detail to provide, what you should share, what you shouldn't share. And the attorney can help you avoid missteps that might come back to bite you if, big if, the matter goes to litigation. And many of these don't go to litigation, and in part that's because once the candidate better understands that you are on solid footing, oftentimes they will respect the decision. But if it does proceed to litigation, again, don't second guess what you've done. Stand behind your decision and have an ally attorney on your side to help explain to the court or the other, whatever decision maker you are in front of, that your decision was valid and appropriate.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think in the essence of time, we'll move to the next question, question number 2. And this one reads, in your opinion, which statistics provide the most credible information concerning potential test fraud? Liz, I know you have some strong feelings here. Can you share your responses, please?
Sure. Thanks. Yes, I do actually have some strong opinions here. We use, or I trust, 2 key what we call security items. Now, there are a number of statistical data forensic techniques that I respect and will employ, but the 2 that I use to actually invalidate exams without any other corroborating evidence, if you will, is what we call old, new, or EVT items, developed by my buddy Dennis, and then what we call Trojan horse items. So the old, new, or EVT items is a technique for inserting a set of uncompromised or new items, say around 10 to 15, into an exam that you know has already been compromised. So given the small number of items, this allows us, my company, to address a compromised exam without actually incurring the cost and effort and time required to do a full rewrite of the exams, because we cannot rewrite our exams as fast, unfortunately, as fast as they get compromised. So by inserting EVTs, or new old items, then we're able to measure a candidate's performance on the new items as compared to the old items. Now, all of these items are scored. They're all valid items, so they're part of the test. And but we simply analyze the difference in performance between the 2, and then working with our statisticians and psychometricians, we set a standard threshold for determining at what statistical variance between the 2 we're going to invalidate scores. Trojan items are similar, but different, actually. So they are they're valid questions, but they are unscored. And you insert maybe 6. We insert 6 into our items, and we incorporate them into an exam, but they are keyed. The key that shows the correct answer is actually an incorrect answer. So there is a valid answer option and valid distractors, but we key one of the incorrect answers as the correct answer. So what often happens when our exams are compromised, the answer key is also compromised. So what happens here is candidates who have relied on this, on having prior access to the exam content, they're going to select the keyed correct answer. And again, relying on our statisticians and psychometricians, we run an analysis of how many times they answer the keyed as opposed to the actual, and what their overall score is in terms of indicating what kind of candidate they actually should be. Trojan horse questions are very simple questions, so you would expect in a minimally qualified candidate to answer them correctly versus as keyed. So both of these techniques have a lot of value to them. They provide a consistent and measurable determination across all of our exam takers globally. They identify candidates who have benefited from prior access to the content. So really focusing on those candidates that you do not want to credential, and focusing on them and making sure that we identify those individuals. and it can be automated. So here at Juniper, we've automated these, and we are therefore actually able to invalidate scores before a pass is ever or a credential is ever granted to a candidate. So we're able to invalidate scores within 24 hours of the exam attempt. And then the last thing I found over working with these items over the last 5 years or so is that they're very easy to explain to stakeholders and exam takers. So people that are raising objections to our approach, when I tell them what we're doing in our methodology, you know, it's very simple, straightforward, and seems somewhat, it seems quite valid. So I very often, or very not very often, get any kind of challenge beyond that explanation. So Steve, those are the two I like best.
Thank you so much. Now, Dennis, I know that you feel strongly about another analysis or statistic. What's one that you feel is most credible?
Thank you, Steve. I just want to make a comment about these that Liz has chosen. They are especially good because it allows you to design security into your exam. But sometimes we can't do that. We can't republish or whatever. One of the statistics we consider our bread and butter statistic is the similarity statistic. And that is looking for potential answer copying, collusion, proxy test taking, organized cheat rings. That statistic is very powerful. Also, it can help you find instructors who are disclosing content. So I really like that statistic. It can give you some very powerful evidence also.
Thank you, Dennis. So moving on to the next question, and this will be addressed primarily to Jennifer again. Question 3. Jennifer, when and how do you believe one should recommend score invalidations to your board or your governing body?
Well, my answer to this one's pretty simple and straightforward. With respect to the when, you should feel empowered to present a recommended score invalidation to your decision maker when you have a good faith basis for questioning the validity of that score. Have you looked at whether it's statistical evidence or videos or reports from a proctor, whatever the basis for the recommendation is, when you've reached a point that you have a good faith reason to believe that the validity of the score might be in question, then that is the appropriate time to present that recommendation to your decision maker, or present the option if you're a program that does not recommend invalidations per se. In terms of the how, you need to make sure that you give the board enough balanced information that they can make a good faith decision of their own. You need to arm them with all of the tools that they need to fully and fairly consider the issue and reach a conclusion. And that means if the candidate provided information, they should see that information. If there is any evidence or information that weighs against invalidation, don't hold it back. Let them see that information as well. And allow your decision maker to seek out follow-up information if they think they need it. And doing all of this puts you in the best position so that if anyone ever questions the decision, you can point to your process and say, look, we undertook a good faith review of the situation and made a decision based on all the evidence in front of us, and that was a good faith, justifiable decision. And it's about as simple as that.
Jennifer, thank you so much. Great, great advice. Moving on to the next question. This one is for Rachel. Rachel, can you describe a few things that should be avoided when using statistics to invalidate scores? What are some of the lessons you've learned along the way?
I think one of the first lessons, Steve, is that we need to remember that the people that we speak to, whether it's our candidates or an attorney that may be questioning some interaction with a candidate, or even arbitrators and judges, are not statisticians. And so it's really important that we avoid using complicated statistical explanations as our rationale for challenging or even canceling scores. So I think it's really important to explain the statistics in ways that the audience, whomever that may be, will be able to understand. And that also correlates with the second. When they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, I think it really oftentimes is easier to grasp the power of statistical evidence if, rather than explaining it all in words, we put it in some type of graph. But if we're using complex charts or graphs to try and illustrate the point, we really can lose folks and water down the strength of that evidence. So visual analytics, I think, is a really key aspect to being able to, in a really straightforward and simple way, depict how compelling statistical evidence can be. And then the last thing I would say is, and this is something Dennis referenced when we first started our conversation, is that when we start to label people, it can become a very emotionally charged conversation. So if we use the word cheat or cheater or some other type of accusatory language, it really takes the focus off of the evidence and a more objective view of the data and starts to create a much more emotionally charged conversation. And so I would really encourage people to continue to focus on data and on the validity or invalidity of scores. And it will enable people to, I think, more objectively understand and hear the information that you're trying to provide to them with this statistical evidence.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. So I've got some questions being posed, and Rachel, I wonder, could you give an example of what to say if not using a complicated statistical explanation, or maybe if you don't have something in mind, maybe I could ask Dennis. Do you have an example of that where you've avoided the jargon and been able to convey something in an easier to understand manner?
Sure. Let me see. Let me give it a try, and you guys can tell me if I did a good job or not. And Dennis, feel free to jump in. So oftentimes we look at statistical evidence of similarities, what Dennis called his bread and butter. And so when we describe this to folks who contact us, we explain that we look at the probability that two individuals seated near to each other would just by chance have the similarities that we're seeing. And what we find in some of our instances is that the probability of that happening just by chance can be so remote that it really leads one to the conclusion that it can only be because of collusion. So, for example, we will explain that these two candidates were seated next to each other, and the probability of them having the response similarities that we saw, and in particular the incorrect responses were out of 4 or 5 item choices or answer choices, they repeatedly chose the same wrong answer, was less than 1 in a million. So that's one way that we have these conversations with folks.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So I hope that was helpful to the questioner. Let's move on, please, to the next slide. And this one, it will be posed to Liz Burns of Juniper Network. Liz, based upon your experience, what are the pros and some of the cons to using statistics to invalidate scores?
Great. Thanks, Steve. So just to, I'm going to fortunately be able to build off of what Rachel said, which I agree with all of it. Statistics they're powerful, and they can illustrate to your stakeholders and candidates exactly what they show. And I find that properly presented, for Rachel's point, people understand statistics. We also use the 1 in a million, and that's one of the things that stops people. So while candidates may argue that they are the one in the million that defies the measurement, your stakeholders, your legal eagles, and others will find this justification very reasonable. Statistics are globally understood and so can be consistently applied across all of the audiences. And finally, we use statistics for all aspects of exam development. So we, being not Juniper, but the broader testing industry. So if you think about it, we use statistics to set our cut scores, to determine our form consistency. Everything about what we do in developing our exams is driven by psychometrics and statistics. So the statistics we then use to determine if someone has benefited from some aspect of exam taking that is not within our guidelines or rules of behavior. If they've benefited by going against those rules or guidelines of behavior, then our use of statistics to invalidate their scores is completely acceptable and in line with best practices. So oftentimes I will talk to candidates about a pass on my exams, meaning not only that you pass the cut score, but you have to pass the statistical analysis we perform to determine the validity of that score. So, and also statistics then, to Rachel's point, allow you to communicate to your candidate without calling them a cheater, because you're not assessing behavior, you're assessing results. And so for all of these reasons, statistics can be used as evidence, if you will, to allow for a reasonable and defensible and reliable enforcement program. Next slide, please, because I think I was asked to talk about cons as well, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the one thing about statistical informants that we find with individuals is that it is a little bit after the horse has left the barn, if you will. So it's a strategy that assumes that your exam content has already been stolen and that individuals have had access to it. So statistics are not really a silver bullet within an overall comprehensive exam strategy program, but they're rather one component of that comprehensive exam strategy plan, which I think was mentioned earlier here, how important that is. Effective exam security requires a comprehensive plan that addresses security issues from all aspects of the problem, from what I call the supply side, where your exam content is exposed and made available, to the demand side, which are the candidates using the compromised content. So your security plan should focus on protecting the value of the certification and the credential for those 99% of test takers that have valid certifications, versus a focus on punishing cheaters. So don't really, my encouragement is using statistics allow you to keep from getting emotional about the entire process, allows us to stay professional and focused on the overall objective of ensuring that we have a valid, reliable, and high integrity credential for our candidates. That's how I wrap those cons up, Steve.
Thank you very much, Liz. So let's move to the next question. This will be directed to Dr. Jack Terry of NBEO. Jack, can you please describe a time when you were successful in using statistics to invalidate a test score? What factors contributed to the success? Have you ever used only statistics to successfully invalidate? Or was there other corroborating evidence involved? Can you share your experiences, please?
Thanks, Steve. The National Board simultaneously administers its Part 1 Applied Basic Science exam to over 1,850 candidates at more than 22 different sites across the country. The exam is given in 4 sessions over 2 days, and each session has 125 different items. We then, after the administration, as part of the post-administration analysis, NBEO uses a statistical response similarities analysis that's performed on the data, looking at the candidate's correct and incorrect responses for our single response and multiple response items that are included on our various exams. When suspicious pairs are identified, by undergoing that analysis. The MBO compares the actual seating charts used at the sites by the proctors to evaluate proximity. If the proximity is confirmed, and we're typically using an index value of 7.5 or higher, that is 10 to the 7.5 power, especially over the multiple sessions. As I mentioned, there are 4 sessions, and it's not infrequent where we'll see if someone is has high index values, it will occur in more than one session. When that occurs, the board considers that there is adequate reason to deem the score as being untrustworthy. The staff level investigation that's occurred results in a statistical analysis of exam results report being prepared, along with an explanatory letter that comes from the board describing the investigation, the penalties, if any, besides the score cancellation, his or her right to appeal to the Judicial Committee of the Board of Directors. And the board has been successful in canceling scores based on the statistical evidence, invoking a bar period in some instances, and having the staff level decision upheld by the Judicial Committee based on these untrustworthy results.
Thank you so much, Jack. That is really helpful background for anyone considering invalidations, I think. I think this next question will be helpful too, and this is going to Rachel. So we just heard about successful invalidations. Rachel, what about times when you had statistical evidence but were unsuccessful in using that evidence to invalidate the score? And why were you not successful in those instances?
So Steve, you had a couple of different examples up here, and I'm going to address both. The first being when we've decided not to pursue a case. And so there are times when we see statistical evidence that makes us think that something unusual has happened and that we have concerns about score validity. But when we start to look at other evidence that would corroborate what the data is showing, we find that we don't have that corroborating evidence. So if we think back to what Jack just told us about, he had the example of using a seating chart and determining if individuals are in proximity. And so that would be an example of, well, if the individuals weren't in proximity, he would not have moved forward with his case. And we have similar types of evidence. We look at seating charts as well in some of our cases. But if we only have statistical evidence and there's not additional corroborating evidence, there are times that we won't move that case forward. In terms of times when we have not been successful in defending a decision, and primarily our cases go to arbitration due to our contractual provisions, which Jennifer talked to us about earlier. So we have contractual provisions that provide arbitration as a resolution for our score review matters if there is a challenge to them. And there are times that we have not been successful at arbitration, and one reason for that has been our inability to convey how truly compelling and strong the statistical evidence is in a case to someone who isn't as familiar with statistics. So sometimes I can remember a time that we actually had an arbitrator tell us that, well, you know, it's hard to win the lottery too, but people do it. And so, you know, they'll talk about the 1 in a million chance or 1 in a whatever chance that people have to win the Powerball. So it's really important to help provide that context for people who are coming into these cases with that type of a framework in mind. And so really needing to shift how they're viewing statistics and what the statistics can help describe is an important part of what we need to do when we get into those situations at arbitration or even at the litigation stage. So those are two examples of times when we haven't been successful, even if the statistical evidence has been there, in either moving forward with a case or defending a cancellation decision.
Thank you, Rachel. So let's move to the next question, please. This will be for Dr. Jack of NBEO. Jack, if a program has a solid testing agreement in place with proctors and candidates, how much time, effort, and money do you estimate is required to invalidate a test score based on statistics?
The cost of invalidating an untrustworthy exam score based on statistical evidence in combination with other evidence does vary considerably based on the specific testing program. The NBEO has found that the cost can be generally divided into three main categories. One, the consultative analysis and follow-up. Two, the staff-level investigation and preparation of the statistical analysis of the exam results, and along with the explanatory letter that goes out to the candidate from the National Board. And that usually has involved an element of legal review. And third, the appeal process to the Judicial Committee with follow-up correspondence. The latter process may also involve a candidate seeking legal representation and submitting a report by a psychometrician to refute our findings. So when all of the direct and indirect costs are included, the average score invalidation with this process that we at least have in place is, and also considering that we have a relatively small cohort, costs between $1,000 and $1,250 per cancellation.
Wow, that is not inexpensive. So I think it's fascinating. We've got another perspective that's very contrasting to what Jack just described. Liz, what about for Juniper? How expensive is it for you?
So we find that it's significantly less expensive to that, and I think maybe because our process is, you know, we're not required to go through maybe as much due diligence for our certification. So there was, as Jack mentioned, upfront expenses related to kind of developing the process and engaging with, you know, getting the data forensic analysis done, and to automate the process. But that expense was pretty much kind of a one-time or pretty contained on a month-to-month basis. And since we were able to automate and take action, and we do not have to accommodate, frankly, any appeals, or we don't have a board that has to consider each item, we revoke results or invalidate results based on the data forensics and statistics only. No other thing is required, and we are not required to offer appeals. So our process is able to be a little bit more streamlined. Therefore, you know, I would say our expense is minimal per score validation that per score or exam that we invalidate. I don't have the exact number, but it's nowhere near that expensive.
Fascinating. Yeah, just a very fascinating contrast between NBEO and Juniper. So let's move to the next question, please. This is going to you again, Liz. And the question is, what internal challenges and obstacles did you confront in instituting your invalidation program? Were they operational, legal, political, all of them, all of the above? Can you please describe those kinds of hurdles?
Sure. Frankly, I found that all were relevant, all 3 items. So for Juniper, we are invalidating our customers and our partners. So these are the people that purchase our products and work with our or work with our customers to implement our technology. So basically, our revenue stream, if you will. Not all of the various groups within our company understand why it is critical in the larger picture for us to invalidate scores of these individuals, because it can create quite a bit of customer dissatisfaction. So the first thing we had to do was to show our stakeholders why exam security was so critical to Juniper as a whole, and that we had to hold customers and partners accountable to our policies and guidelines with regards to exam security. So frankly, this took about 2 years for me to get through. It was the first 2 years of our enforcement program, and we bit off little chunks, and we've made a slow and increasing enforcement program, and then communicated large and loud to the sales and partner account managers, who are directly responsible for the relationships with the companies that found themselves with employees with invalidated exams. So we basically created, over those 2 years, a significant amount of trust and buy-in to the process, because they began to see the benefit of it. And they also began to see that customers and partners didn't object to that much when they were identified, because the process is very accurate. So at this point, our exam security enforcement process is known and an accepted policy, and stakeholders know what to expect, and therefore we get very little, if any, pushback. While we were engaging with the stakeholders, I also had to ensure that the process was legally defensible. So we were quite involved in addressing legal concerns, but it was relatively easy given the clear and consistent documentation, our policies, our canon of agreement, et cetera, and our use of objective statistics versus subjective eyewitness type indicators. So the lawyers loved this. And it helped that we were using a third-party consulting firm to build our security items and perform our analysis, because that gave the entire process a fair amount of credence. And the above efforts were really one-time challenges. Our ongoing challenge, of course, is the operational issues related to exam security enforcement. So exam security, as we've mentioned a couple times already here, is an evolving process. So as new technologies and techniques are created, we have to implement those to catch up to how those can accommodate our requirements. And then, of course, the exam thieves, those people that are offering our content, their approaches are ever evolving. So we have to stay ahead or not too far behind that crew as well. So it really covers the whole gamut, Steve.
Yeah, interesting. So thank you, Liz. Dennis, I know you have a perspective here. I think you have a perspective here, Dennis.
Yeah, I do think, Steve, I had myself on mute, so you did not hear me wrestling. I have a perspective based on working with clients. One client in particular asked us to look at data. We did. We found some evidence of some improper behavior. This client was a university. And they said, well, we want to expel this student from our program. And they put everything together, as we've talked about here in this session. But the provost office looked at that and said, no, we're not going to move forward on this. So I think you really have to consult with your stakeholders and get their buy-in and get their support. You have to consider where you're going, because you can go down the path, and if you didn't look before you leapt, you just might end up in the wrong place. And that's what happened to this program.
Great. Thank you for that perspective. So I think we've got a poll now, and I'm going to launch this. And the question is, has your organization, have you instituted a formal statistical analysis or data forensics program? And then there are some different responses. Yes, and we invalidate based on that. Or yes, we have data forensics, but we don't invalidate. We'd like to, but are not sure how. We're planning to. And no, I don't know if we ever will. So looks like about half of the respondents or half of the attendees have responded. I'd love to get a few more people responding, and this is going to be really interesting. Got almost 3/4, a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to close this down. And I'm going to share the results. And beautiful, 35% have a data forensics program they invalidate. And I'm surprised, Dennis, 22% don't, and they're not sure if they ever will. And does that catch you by surprise at all, Dennis Maines?
Yeah, it doesn't catch me by surprise. It takes some time and effort to put these procedures in place, and we know a lot of programs feel like they're okay, but and some are, but what we've learned is you don't know until you look.
That's right. So I'm going to hide this, and we had another survey poised, but I think in the essence of time, let's just press on, please, Rochelle, to question 10. All right, pressing on to question 10. I am not seeing question 10. All right, so this question is for Rachel. And Rachel, what I'm going to do is, while you're answering this, I'm going to switch the slides to my PC. So the question is, have you instituted any key performance indicators or other measurements around your use of statistical analyses and invalidations to measure program impact and success? And if so, what are they?
So Steve, we do have KPIs. I want to make sure to just preface this with a couple of contextual pieces of information. One is that at least in admissions testing, we actually have some truth in testing statutes that we comply with, which requires that the testing organizations follow a certain process when addressing score validity concerns. And the second is that we look for corroborating evidence. So even if we have some statistical evidence, we do look for corroborating evidence as we go through our process. So with our current security framework, when we consider what kind of KPIs we have, we do look at volume of cases that we have open and also look at our success rate in defending those cases in arbitration, as well as the resolution of those cases at panel, which a number of other organizations I think refer to as their board. We consider this a panel that we present the evidence to. And then we also look at, in the process that examinees are given, which options are they choosing and how are those options resolving the question that we had around score validity. So we look at metrics to capture the choices that examinees are selecting. We look at the outcome of those, and we help do a number of things with that data, including not only planning for capacity, but also looking, are there other ways that we can better help examinees at the front end, so either deterring or preventing this conduct, or later addressing decisions that they may need to make. We also use this a number of different metrics to measure the impact of policy or contract changes on ACT's security posture. So, for example, are we seeing the number or percentage of concerning cases flagged or open increasing or decreasing after a policy change? Or has implementation of different security capabilities impacted our program in a way that we would have expected? So are we seeing less of certain types of behavior due to, for example, a focused messaging campaign that we might, just as an example, that we might want to track and trend? So because of these metrics and KPIs, we do know that using statistics has allowed us to have a more accurate view of, for example, test event concerns than just having irregularity or hotline reports would give us. And we know that the data is compelling and is able to provide us information to focus efforts differently as we move forward with improving our program, which, as Liz said, a comprehensive program is one that still needs to constantly evolve and address different threats and different remediation opportunities.
Rachel, thank you. I'm just dealing with...
I see that. That's okay.
Yeah. American Express spam. So, and also thank you for responding while I was indelicately changing our computer, which is showing the slide. So, and just absolutely love the whole measure so you can better manage perspective that you just shared. That is music to our ears. So next slide, this next question, I'm going to pose it to both Jack and Jennifer. Jack first. Jack, what legal agreements or legal foundation need to be in place in order to consider invalidating based on statistics?
Well, obviously, the legal agreement between the board, the testing agency, and the candidate is imperative. The National Board has developed a broad ethics program, which specifically includes the National Board's ethics policy and the candidate's exam conduct and exam security agreement. The agreement itself emphasizes that it's a violation to engage in any conduct before, during, or after the exam that is inconsistent with the purposes of our exams, that is, public protection and ensuring that each candidate's score accurately reflects the candidate's actual knowledge, competence, and performance. The candidate is required to review and sign the agreement before she or he can register to take any MBEO exam. In addition, the candidate is also reminded of the agreement, the terms of the agreement, before and to re-sign it at the time of the exam. The agreement between the National Board and the candidate describes that obviously they understand and agree that the MBEO can make this determination of the existence or occurrence of improper conduct, while it's, as Jennifer said earlier, doing such in good faith, and that such an action or determination can be based on the methods that are available to the board, to include statistical evidence, observation, documentation, and other evidence. So it's very fundamental to have all this spelled out because the agreement, at least in our case, is between MBEO and the candidate.
And I don't have much to add to that, just to echo Jack's points. The candidate agreement is really the foundation for any action you want to take in the future with respect to that candidate's exam performance. It is your contract with the test takers, and in the event that there is a dispute about a decision that you make or frankly, an activity of the candidate, a court will look to that candidate agreement because it's that agreement that defines your rights and your obligations. And the court will look to see, did you comply with your obligations in good faith? So the candidate agreement is key. Keep a copy of it as it evolves over time. Keep historical copies of it, and consider it a living, breathing document. And don't be afraid to revisit your candidate agreement over time because you may become aware of circumstances and situations that you didn't contemplate when it was originally drafted. And it can be quite helpful to revisit the agreement after a security breach and think about whether there are provisions that should be added or removed or improved. And similarly, having your internal policies and procedures mapped out before you're knee-deep in a problem can be quite helpful. Have your plan in advance and then apply it fairly and consistently when an issue comes up. And it sounds like that's what NBEO does.
That's right. So, Jennifer, just another follow-on question. Should a candidate agreement include a provision that states that similarity analysis or some other statistic may be used in suspected cheating investigations? Does it need to spell it out explicitly that way?
Well, here's my view on that. It is not an absolute requirement, but it is also not a bad idea.
Wow.
You know, your candidate agreement serves two purposes, really. One purpose is the obvious one, to form a binding contract with your candidate and to provide a legal foundation for your decisions. But there's another goal, and that is really messaging to candidates. This document is an opportunity for you to speak, so to speak, with your test takers and set out their obligations and their duties and what's right and what's wrong. And there's no downside to letting them know that you have these tools available to you and you may use them. And certainly that can help them better understand, if they are considering bad behavior, that maybe I'm going to be watched and I shouldn't do it. But if your agreement doesn't have that in there, don't be afraid and think, oh, well, I can't use statistical analyses because that's not the case.
Okay. Thank you for that perspective. Now, we are bumping up against the hour. And I know we opened up with the invites, we invited people to ask questions, and I've got at least one audience question. Now, we really strive to keep these sessions under an hour. If you need to stop, we will send out the presentation, a recording of the presentation, the slides, and questions and answers. So if you need to ring off, that's fine. But we will stay on the line and address these questions running over the hour if your schedule allows. So here's the first audience question we received. We see a lot of exam takers who score very high in very short amounts of time. We know that it would be impossible to even read the questions in that short time span, but it's hard to prove cheating. Is there a guideline on the amount of time taken per question that we can use to take these cheaters down? And Dennis, I know you've crafted a response to this. Do you mind explaining it, please?
So, sure. So we have seen some candidates with reading rates that exceed 1,000 words per minute, which is about the reading speed of a trained speed reader, which is very, very fast. The average adult reads about 250 to 300 words per minute on non-technical content. Most of this content is very technical, would be even slower. So a lot of these that are so fast, it's just unbelievable. So my suggestion is you verify the reading rates. You can do that with a reading test. You give them some content that is very similar to the content you have on the test. You have them read that. You have them give them a few questions to measure comprehension. We're not trying, and verify. Trust but verify. That's one of the things we say. Our research indicates the high-speed, erratic reading strongly indicates brain dump usage, as we correlate with that with known cheaters who were detected using Trojan horse technology.
Thank you, Dennis. Now, you had drawn some conclusions. Do you want me to share those, or would you like to?
I'll just share these quickly. I think, first of all, as we said earlier, this is all about validity. It's not about behavior. And these are quotes from Greg Cizik. And definitely, one of the things you should take away from this session is that you need to have policies. You need to have procedures. You need to have your whole organization on board for this, have your agreements in place, and you should be able to act with confidence if you do all the things that our panelists have recommended today.
Thank you, Dennis. So I have 2 minutes after the hour. We did have a couple of other questions. We're sort of ready to conclude, but panelists, are all of you or any of you able to respond to some of these questions that have arisen? Or shall we, I guess, I don't want to impugn on your time too much longer, but if you're willing to stay on, I'll pose these questions for the audience.
Yeah.
This
is Dennis. I can stay on 10 minutes.
Yeah, same for Liz. I can't see the questions, so you have to read them.
Sure. So here's a question. Why stop at invalidating test scores? If the evidence is strong enough to do that, why not go further and impose a penalty beyond the need to retake the exam? Does any panelists have a reaction to that?
This is Jennifer. I can jump in. I can tell you that I've seen programs implement a wide variety of actions in response to a problem. It can range from invalidating a score to a ban, permanent or temporary. It can include a warning letter on the low end versus a permanent ban on the other extreme, letters of apology, mandatory ethics courses. There really are a wide variety of sanctions that I've seen imposed. The only observation I would make is that if you're truly dealing with simply statistical anomalies, some of the penalties are better suited for situations where you have some evidence of the intent, the malintent of the test taker. So certainly in the face of a statistical anomaly, you can, if you reach a good faith basis for concluding that you can't trust the score, a score invalidation is the natural response to a situation like that. And programs may or may not be comfortable going beyond that, depending on what other information and evidence is available.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we talked earlier about the statistics that Liz finds most powerful and credible, and then Dennis talked a little bit about similarity. Here's a question, and maybe Dennis, can you use statistics to invalidate a score based on a previous score by the individual on the same exam? So I think we're talking about gains and losses.
Well, we are talking about gains and losses, but we also, and the answer is yes, you can do that. The gains analysis is usually rather weak statistically, so you definitely, this is a place where, and so let's just be really clear here. We're talking about circumstantial evidence. We're talking about information where we don't have direct evidence of misbehavior or misconduct. And so what we're doing is we're questioning the validity of the score. So at a certain point, you have to say, well, how much evidence do I need? Do I need other pieces of evidence, whether it's statistical or other information, to help clarify the inference? Yes, we should go forward. No, we should leave it alone. But you can use other information. Now, specifically for retest, besides just looking at gains, you can look at answer rates, the rates at which they answer the questions. You can also look at answer change rates. If they're not changing answers in the same way, and we do this often in educational testing, where the wrong to right answer change rates are very high on one exam, very low on another exam, and we say, well, this is a behavioral thing. What changed in their behavior? There's definitely statistics you can use to bolster these, but we do call into question scores based on gains. This is one thing that ETS does. When they see high gains on the SAT, they will then do a similarity analysis to gather more information around that gain and whether or not if there's an appearance that there was answer copying or non-independent test taking.
Thank you, Dennis. So two people asked questions that are pretty similar, and it has to do with this threshold. The first question is, what is the lowest threshold for invalidating an exam? and this says a low-stakes exam is 1,000 to 120, and then similarly, we've got a question regarding the probability estimates. Is there a minimum probability below which you should possibly not take action? What's the minimum threshold you're concerned with, Dennis, for this is not something we're going to worry about versus I want to dig in here?
Well, so I approach this question from the perspective of our goal, which is to strengthen exam security, which may not be quite the goal in the mind of the questioners. But that is, we just look for the worst of the worst and make sure that we're on good, strong footing. And then I would recommend you take that to your board and set that in policy, whatever the threshold is, and how you defend it. So I would consult with your statistical advisors, also your content people, to say what seems reasonable here. Also look at some data, make sure you understand what empirically this means. Ultimately, it's a policy decision, and it comes down to what in statistics we call type 1 and type 2 errors. The type 1 error is there we make when we falsely accuse someone of producing a bad result, maybe cheating or something. The type 2 error is when we don't detect when someone did do that. And most programs would rather commit type 2 errors than type 1 errors. They would rather not have. They would rather minimize false accusations and let people go by and just focus on the worst of the worst. That's where the thresholds come in policy and policy decisions. In my own personal view, for one chance in 1,000, I would view that as very good supporting evidence if I had other statistics or other information that also went along with this. By itself, I would not consider it to be sufficiently strong to take action. In fact, this is really data mining to a certain degree. And if you turn over enough rocks, you're going to find something odd. So you need to be somewhat conservative if it's a single statistic by itself. But if you start gathering other data, then it can really help strengthen your case.
Thank you very much. So we're coming up on 10 minutes after the hour. Out of courtesy to everyone's time, I want to say thank you to Liz Burns of Juniper Networks, Rachel Schenig of ACT, Jennifer Semko of Baker & McKenzie, Jack Terry of MBEO. Dennis, thank you for putting this panel together. I trust this has been useful and helpful to the audience. We strive to give really helpful content, and I think the experience shared here has been terrific. So we hope to see you next time. Panelists, thank you so much, and everyone have a great 4th of July. We'll see you next month for the Caveon webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you.